if how many of you were here last year, but I can say that the most moving part of the evening was the introduction of the Anthony Shadid Award for journalism when his family came and as we inaugurated the award. And tonight, with great pleasure, we're going to have the first award presented to Christiane Amanpour. I have to tell you, she has been a hard person to track down. We have wanted her here for years, and there's no better coincidence than having her here to receive this award. So I'm looking for David. Oh, there you are. David Hoffman is going to present the award. David has been a White House correspondent, but in spite of that, he's been a very good guy. He's a contributor to Foreign Policy and the Washington Post, which now I guess we call them FP and WAPO, right? Yeah, and he's a former editor of Anthony Shadid, so no more appropriate person to present the award to Christiane. David.
Thank you all, and I would just like to say a special thank you to Ralph Nader, who doesn't know it, but he gave me my first job in Washington. Many years ago, Ralph Nader started a small little news service called Capitol Hill News Service. And as a young reporter, I signed up for it. And one of the ironclad rules of this little news service, there were about 7 of us, was you could never rewrite a press release. You always had to go out and get the quotations yourself. That was how we knew the man of principle had started it. And fortunately, I had a pretty long and enjoyable career in journalism. But I would have to say to you that the great highlight of my 30 years as a journalist, a foreign correspondent, and a White House correspondent was the privilege of being Anthony Shadid's editor at the Washington Post. Anthony was a beacon, not only for readers, but also for those of us in journalism. He shined a great light into dark corners of the world, a light that exposed the fear of people under the bombs in Iraq, huddled in a dark room in a hospital in Lebanon. And I often think about what made his journalism so special. Certainly all of us are exposed to and consume enormous amounts of reporting from around the world. What made this particular journalist so extraordinary? Sure, he had the Arabic language skills, which he had worked hard at for many years. Sure, he had read deeply, very deeply into the history. He would roll his eyes when I would recommend another Mahfouz novel as a model for his work. Sure, he was courageous in the face of danger. But all of that sort of fades in the background, because what really made Anthony so great was that he listened to the people he wrote about, and he cared very, very deeply about them. When his pencil was put down, when the story was finished, for years and years, he carried this empathy and understanding about them with him. He curated it. And I realized this one day when we had finished another one of our great editor-reporter struggles. Anthony had written an extraordinary history of one architect's long struggle in Cairo to build a park of culture. It was a beautiful story. It was also very long. Anthony was known to send me articles thousands of words longer than we had planned, which would then send me into the top editors asking for 2 more pages, please. And of course, I always got it. But the thing is that after this article was published, and I said to him, how is it that you have such knowledge over time? How is it that you can understand this man's struggle and his quest to build this park over 30 and 40 years? And Anthony revealed to me, he said, you know, David, I didn't just meet this guy. I've known him for 20 years. I've been saving this. I've been thinking about it. And that's a rare and precious talent in a journalist, to understand people and their narratives and to think about them not in the rush of 5 or 10 minutes or even a day, but over decades. So it's very, very fitting tonight that we honor the legacy of Anthony Shadid with the first Anthony Shadid Award to Christiane Amanpour, a journalist who I think has exemplified these qualities that Anthony represented. As many of you know, but I'll briefly recap, Christiane grew up in Tehran, received her education at British and U.S. institutions. The Iranian Revolution played a very formative and important part in her own decision to become a journalist. From CNN in 1983, she became a correspondent and, of course, broke really through into our consciousness with her coverage of those wars, the Persian Gulf War, the Bosnia conflict. And much of her reporting is focused on the Middle East, and a lot of it on the treatment and advancement of women in the Arab world and the humanitarian cost of the violence that continues today. And, today, Christiane is global affairs anchor for ABC News and chief international correspondent for her CNN show, Amanpour. But she is so much more. And I can tell you that the thing that makes her work so remarkable and stands out is this ability to attain a certain credibility, nuance, and responsibility in her coverage of these very, very charged and very, very difficult issues and times. She's someone who can deliver a full and accurate picture of events and issues that define the modern Middle East and can tear down the terrible stereotypes that we all see and suffer. And aside from these things, I'd like to add a personal observation. Anthony Shadid could be a poet, a novelist, a journalist in 3,000 or 4,000 words, and in books like House of Stone, his last, which left us all laughing and in tears at the same time. But Christiane does her magic a little bit in poetry length. Television is different. It compresses. There are no thousands of words. There are dozens of them. And if you listen to her, you will see what makes her different in these few bits of poetry, the knowledge and the understanding she brings to those fleeting moments on the air. It's really extraordinary, and it certainly is extraordinary for television. And what I really admire about her work, certainly it's not the access to kings and presidents, and I certainly respect her courage and her determination, but what I really admire is that much like Anthony was, Christiane has become a beacon in dark corners of the world. And for that, we thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Jim. And thank you, David, for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be here tonight. It is, I guess, a night where I'm really full of mixed emotions, and that despite the joy and the honor of receiving this award, because really this is about Anthony Shadid this night and this award, and to receive the first one in his name is of profound, profound joy for me and a great, great honor. His mother is here, his best friend is here, his mother's husband is here, family, and you know how much we love you, love your son, and love everything that he stood for. Who amongst us here never read The Prophet by Kahlil Gibran, a required rite of passage? It's a wonderful, wonderful book. It's a great, great honor to receive this in that regard as well. And who amongst us is immune to the elephant in the room, which is what happened in Boston last night? How many of us feel this burden of association and hope beyond hope that this doesn't turn out to be what some people think it might be? No conclusions yet. Maybe a lot of people read this incredible post in the New York Times by a young Pakistani medical student in Boston who talked about having been thrown from his chair, having ran in fear, having wanted to go back to help the wounded, but couldn't because he was with his wife. And then he thought, and what about the way I look? What if I'm a suspect? He wrote, after his horror at what happened, he said the next step was to hope that the perpetrator was not a lunatic who would become the new face of 1 billion people, not a murderer who would further fan the flames of Islamophobia, not an animal who would obstruct the ability of thousands of students to complete their educations in the United States, not an extremist who would maim and hurt the very people who were still recovering from the pain of September 11th. President Obama and Governor Deval Patrick have shown great restraint in their words and have been careful not to accuse an entire people for what one madman may have done, but others may not be so kind. Again, there are no conclusions. Is it international? Is it domestic? But like all of you, I'm not Pakistani and I'm not Arab, but I am part Iranian. And I do understand the burden of association. And I know that when we know who did this, we will all unite in strong and unequivocal condemnation. And our thoughts and our prayers go to the people who suffered and died in Boston and to all their families. And tonight, our thoughts and prayers are even stronger with the family of Anthony Shadid. His wife couldn't be here, and I understand that. It's too painful and it's too raw. And yet, wouldn't it have been great if he would have been able to write this story? Every single story that he wrote is unmatchable. From his depth of experience and knowledge, and for all the ways that David, as his editor, described him, he would have been able to tell this story, no matter which way it turned out. He was an American reporter, but he was a global citizen. He was really proud of his Arab heritage. He was able to give a voice to those who didn't have one, and to make people who lived in the shadows no longer be invisible. He had that uncommon gift of knowing so much and yet never talking down, always making his stories and his reporting and his journalism about everything that we care about the human beings caught up in these massive global events that in the end touch each and every one of us, every which way. A friend of mine and a friend of Anthony's wrote to me just last night saying that he was happy to hear that I'd be receiving the inaugural Anthony Shadid Award. He said, Anthony was an old friend of mine from Cairo in the early 1990s when we were both studying Arabic and starting out as reporters. Even back then, it was easy to recognize Anthony's formidable gifts as a storyteller, his commitment that reporting could be a force for greater understanding, his passion at finding grace and nuance in the lives of people whose images had so often been reduced to cliché. He read voluminously, he mastered Arabic, and he engaged with friends of every political camp. He didn't take sides. He didn't have an agenda. He wasn't pigeonholed in any ideological left, right, up, down, center, nowhere. He just told the human story. He understood the power and the absolutely vital necessity of telling the story of the other, of telling the story from the other's perspective, of being big enough and smart enough to understand that the other always has a story. And he knew that to his very bones. Anthony went through so much. Again, today, another thing that came into my mind, the Pulitzers were announced this week, just yesterday, I think. Congratulations to everybody who won. Tyler Hicks, the wonderful New York Times photographer, was amongst the New York Times winners for photography. And of course, Tyler Hicks was that valiant friend, that friend in the foxhole who tried to do everything he could to resuscitate and to save Anthony at that last moment when he succumbed to that last terrible asthma attack. What was he trying to do? He was trying to tell the story of Syria, which remains a blot on the face of our democracy, which is still to be worked out. And he was trying to tell the human story because, as his wife Nada told me shortly after he died, when I interviewed her about House of Stone, Anthony's last book, which she told me was a real labor of love for him, that it was about peace and love, and it was really important. Too much of the news from there has come from activists and others with an agenda. And he wanted to go in and tell the real story. And he didn't come out. I strongly believe that he would have won a Pulitzer again had he been able to complete that mission. He knew the dangers, obviously, of what he was doing, but as his wife said, and I know, I can attest, he wasn't a war junkie. He didn't go just to be brave and to be, awarded. He went because he knew that to be a reporter, especially in our great democracy, where the press is a member of the Fourth Estate, It's a member of our civil society. Without a free and fair and rigorous independent press, without journalists who are willing to report without fear nor favor, there is no healthy democracy. And he understood that. And he gave his life for that, so that all of us can be richer, because knowledge is the foundation of everything. And he knew that you had to be the real eyes and ears of what was going on in the world, and that's what he did. And it's humbling, and it's fantastic at the same time. And even though Nada can't be here, and when I asked her, because she's a journalist as well, his wife, would she be able to continue to be a journalist? She said, I don't know. Journalism took away from me my husband and took the father of our children away. I don't know. I really hope she knows, and that her parents know, that this is the most noble profession. That done well, it is the kind of work that none of us can do without. And that, done well, it can change the world. And I strongly believe that Anthony, for all that he did and all the work he did over all the years that he did it, changed the world that he reported on and changed the way we all and you all understand the world. And there's no better tribute than that. And this award is for Anthony Shadid, and I am unbelievably proud to have won it. And I thank you all very much indeed.